Thanks for listening to Uncle Sam's Soccer Podcast, keeping you up to date with the latest in American soccer. And don't forget to subscribe.
Hello everyone, welcome to Uncle Sam's Soccer Podcast. My name's Steven Jodrant. Joining me today is Jacob Troba and Armand Kafai. And on today's episode, it is another interview special. We sit down with President and Chief Soccer Officer of the Rochester Rhinos, Pat Ercoli. Now listeners, this is a two-part interview. In this part one, we discuss how Rochester almost became an MLS club and the ups and downs the club has had. Come back next week for part two, where we discuss how the club is moving forward. Lastly, if you haven't done so already, hit that subscribe button, leave us a 5-star review, and follow us at Uncle Sam's Soccer Pod. Now, let's get to it.
Joining us now on the show is Pat Ercoli, President / Chief Soccer Officer of the Rochester Rhinos. Ercoli actually played club football for the Rochester Lancers and the Jacksonville T-Men in the North American Soccer League. Also played for Cleveland Force of the Major Indoor Soccer League from 1985 to 1986. Ercoli also coached the Rochester Rhinos from 1996 to 2004. Pat, welcome to the show. How's it going today?
Great, guys. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Man, it's been a wild journey for the Rhinos. Obviously, Armand listed quite a bit of what you have done. You also have held the title of General Manager, and now you're the President / Chief Soccer Officer. What has that journey been like for you?
Like I said, I pretty much have worn every hat in the business. I've been involved or competed against, or we were talking about it the other night. I mean, every coach out there, Bradley. All the national team coaches, I've looked back. We actually recently moved into a new house. So, all my scrapbooks and stuff, my wife piled into a van, and they're all in the basement. And as I was flipping through, I saw David Sarkin and I played together in Buffalo. And so a lot of the people that are something to do with soccer have had a great contribution in this sport. I've had some ties to in some manner. So it's a good feeling.
Pat, I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you. You were the manager of the Rhinos when they won the U.S. Open Cup back in 1999. Tell us what that was like.
Well, at the time, Rochester didn't have soccer for something like almost 20, I would say 18 years. So we came back in 96, just on the wave of the new MLS that had just started. We came to life, and I think our community kind of tied into it because we were a competitive team, and there weren't many teams in the country at that time between our league and the MLS. I want to say maybe 16 to 18 teams, but so we had a great support. And I remember that first year, I think we went 2-8 at the start, so it was kind of disheartening to my wife and I because we had 15,000 people at the stadium and we weren't necessarily winning. But we turned it around that year and we went into two finals in 96. We lost to Bruce Arena, DC United, and lost to Seattle in our regular league season. And the next year, I think we lost in the playoffs. And in 98, we took off. I mean, we brought in a bunch of different players that had played with national teams that were at a high level. I wouldn't necessarily say we were at the MLS's level, but we certainly had a lot of competitive players that wanted to prove themselves. So in 98, we won the regular season championship, and we kept saying to ourselves, okay, what's the next thing we're going to do? And the U.S. Open Cup was a challenge for us, and would have been great to do the double that year, but I think we lost in Minnesota in the final of the regular season. But the Open Cup, just the people involved. Jason Kreis, I guess, played with Dallas, and he came into Rochester. And we could have lost in the first round to Brooklyn Italians, but we pulled it out in overtime. Then we played Dallas. Jason Kreis basically made a comment that said, when we play on the Rochester field, it's a smaller field. Wait until they get to a big field. So that kind of motivated our guys, and we went off again, and I think we won another 3 games against MLS teams. Actually, beat Colorado, and Mooch was the coach at that time, and there were a host of players that have played either national team or are in the game now coaching. So that team that we were able to defeat. It was an interesting championship. We certainly enjoyed winning it, and it's a feather in our cap because it was a national title and it brought national attention to Rochester. But through that journey, I mean, luck plays a part in it. We were playing in Virginia Beach, and there were about 45-mile-an-hour winds. And I recall we were playing Columbus, and the final was going to be in Columbus. Had they won, they would have been in the final. And as it turns out, we won basically, I would say, because we chose to go against the wind in the first half. The second half, I think they outplayed us against the wind, but they died halfway through the second half. And we were able to score 2 goals in the last 10 minutes to go to the final. So there were a lot of moments throughout that whole championship that made good memories.
For our listeners out there, the Rhinos are the only team in the MLS era to be a non-MLS team to win the Open Cup. But Pat, I wanted to jump. We're actually doing some research, and we stumbled upon a report from the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle talking about how the Rhinos could potentially play in Major League Soccer in 2004. Now, obviously, you were around. Can you just talk about what were the conversations that were being held back then?
Well, Lamar Hunt owned 3 teams in the MLS. He was part of the NASL when I played, and he had some fond memories in the course of his involvement with the NASL, and part of those memories were Rochester. Rochester always played some kind of a pivotal role in the growth of soccer in the United States. In that era of, I think it was 1989 or 1970, a decision had to be made whether the league moved forward or not, and they needed one additional team, and Rochester happened to be that team to come forth that helped the league move forward, and Lamar was part of it. So he had some fond memories of the people that were involved at the time, and he felt that because of our success both on and off the field, that Rochester could be a market that would be like a Green Bay. So he wanted to bring Kansas City here at the time, and I don't know what the reasons were, but I know they met with the owners here several different times. I could only surmise that I think some of the ownership group on our end was concerned because MLS really wasn't doing as well as it is today at the time, and the risk involved for them was greater than what they wanted to put forth, and obviously they felt that if they built the stadium and played in the league that we were in, they'd continue to have the success that we had, and didn't see the bigger picture, the bigger vision. And especially because many of the teams that were in our league, like Portland, Seattle, Montreal, Vancouver, they all saw the bigger picture. And of course, today they all have MLS franchises. I can't say that coming to Rochester would that wave have continued. I mean, we can all guess at that. But I mean, having an interest in that, bringing the right players, and I think we've shown even after our Rhinos' success off the field wasn't quite what it was as it was at the beginning. When the Flash came into town, which was the Western New York Flash, and I helped bring them in, and we had all the best players and the national team players, we drew well. So there is still an interest out there in Rochester that I believe would have success if you have the right personnel in place, the right players here, and they're competitive, and they play at a high level, and they're recognizable.
Now, Pat, let me ask you this, because you just mentioned it. At the time, in the early part of the decade, there was thought that Kansas City would relocate to Rochester, and Rochester would be that MLS club.
Yeah, I think Brian Bliss, who happens to be from Rochester, was the assistant coach, and they were the talk. The talk was that they would come in. I think he was going to be the head coach, and I would take on an assistant coaching position if it were offered to me, which I think it was going to be offered to me. And so I looked forward to it, but it never happened.
Do you know how close the deal was to happening?
Well, they came here and they drove around and looked at the facility that we currently have in Rochester. There were some questions asked about parking, from my understanding. Our ownership groups actually flew down to Dallas and met with them at his headquarters with his sons, I believe. So it was pretty close. Dan Garber, I don't believe, was on board with it. He had a different vision, but I think that Lamar Hunt owning 3 teams pulled a little weight.
I mean, how bummed was the club after not being able to make a move like this or to enter Major League Soccer? I mean, it must have been somewhat devastating for the community in hopes of, hey, Major League Soccer might have a club, or we might have a Major League Soccer club here.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing. Sacramento, for instance, if you want to take a chapter out of our book, is very similar, right? I mean, they had some great success at the beginning. They won a championship, and it looked like, for all intents and purposes, they were going to be granted an MLS franchise. The community's on board because they're sitting there saying, okay, MLS is coming. We're going to support the team because we want the team to be involved in MLS. And then all of a sudden, it doesn't happen right away. So it was the same thing here. I mean, we always envisioned, like any player or any coach, to want to play at a higher level. Community was envisioning that. And I think partly the state, because they gave us $25 million to build the stadium. And we were the second one. I mean, Columbus was the first one, but that was pretty much funded by Lamar Hunt. This one was funded by New York State. So, the city provided the property, and so the understanding was that Lamar would bring the team in, the ownership group would retain the stadium, and if there were any cash calls, Lamar would essentially pay for the cash calls and then retain some percentage of the stadium depending on that amount. At the time, there was always cash calls because, the league was growing and it was a single entity. So, it wasn't unheard of probably to put in $2 or $3 million, $4 million a year, especially if you own 3 teams. And at that time, I think, there were several individuals that were billionaires that had 3 teams. So that was the thing. I mean, the city, yes, I would say that the city, our fans certainly were disappointed because that was what we spoon-fed them for such a long time that, hey, we're going to eventually go to MLS, and as soon as the new stadium comes in, that's the direction. Well, then the stadium was built in 2006, and that didn't happen. And then MLS, as you can tell, I mean, to me, I view it as, billionaires and the millionaires that we had as owners sitting there and trying to play against somebody that has more money. It just doesn't work. So I think we came to a conclusion that, the sale ship the ship sailed once Lamar Hunt decided, and the league decided not to come the first time.
Pat, let's fast forward here a little bit. After not making it to MLS, the Rhinos had a rocky time. The team was declared insolvent in 2008. However, in March of the same year, Rob Clark took over the club, assuring financial stability. After 2 seasons, the club joined the new NASL for the 2010 season, playing temporary in U.S. Soccer's Division II Professional League due to the federation refusing the NASL's application for sanctioning. the Rhinos switched leagues again before the 2011 season to the third division USL Pro League. In January 2013, the Rhinos became the official USL Pro affiliate of the New England Revolution. A few years later, on November 30th, 2017, the Rhinos announced they would go on a hiatus. And then a year later, the new third division league, USL League One, and returned to the field in 2020. How difficult were those years from 2008 until 2017?
Well, I came back. So I left in 04. Rob Clark took over the team in 08, and he hired Darren Tilley, who happened to be one of my players. When we won, the U.S. Open Cup and all the championships. Great guy, very sarcastic Englishman. But he was a determined, hardworking individual. And I got calls from Rob at the time and several individuals that wanted me to come back as coach. And I kept telling them, look, just give Darren time. He's a great guy. He's a chapter out of my book. He'll be successful. And I just wasn't interested in coming back as a coach anymore. So in 09, I think he was here 2 years, and then they released him. And I said to them, look, I have no interest in coming back as a coach. And so they said, well, how about as a general manager? And I said, I will, but again, it'd have to be a long-term contract. And they weren't interested in doing that at the time. So I came back part-time and continued to work. And, I'd show up for meetings with the coach. And I prefaced it with, I'm only going to come back if I can put the right coach in place here, because I know what it's going to take to win. And, the budget wasn't quite as healthy as it was when I was coach. So I knew the type of coach that we were going to need in order to win. And it was Bob Lilly. So I contacted Bob, and we had several talks for weeks and weeks. He was in that same mold where he didn't want to come back and coach anymore. But I was able to convince him. He believed in me, and he knew that I was an honest individual. And, he'd had some situations with other clubs where, he felt he was given a raw deal. So I was able to convince him to come back because we would support him. And he came back, and so that's how it all started again. We then had, like you said, the NASL situation. I wasn't involved in that initial stage where they decided to go to the NSL. But when we did come in, Bob and I talked about it, and we felt there were pluses and minuses with it. The NASL, essentially, to me, just having been in the business for such a long time, I just felt that the direction they were taking it in was going to be very costly. Bob Lenarduzzi from Vancouver was in it for 1 year, and then they were going to go to the MLS. Joey Saputo was in it for 1 year, and then they were going to the NASL. The MISL. So both of them were going to be departing to the MLS. So I just said to our ownership, I said, look, once these guys go, you're talking about teams that just aren't going to survive. It's too costly. And so we went back to the USL at the time and told them we wanted to. And it wasn't just us. It was Orlando City as well. Both of us went back and said, we want to be part of the USL again. So that's what transpired with that. How's it been over the last few years? I mean, when I came back, the mission was how do we survive in a 25 or in a 15,000 seat stadium, one USL team, and you have to fill X amount of dates. And we had at most for soccer, 20 dates. So my job became more than just being the general manager of the team. It became operations manager for the stadium. So we were able to make a deal with the Salins in Buffalo for naming rights. They brought in the New York Flash. with probably the best team ever put together by them, with Marta and Christy St. Clair and Morgan and all the best players in the world. And they played here in the stadium. So we had success, even though we weren't having it necessarily with the Rhinos. We were starting to have it with the women's game. And then we were able to bring in lacrosse. We brought in the Rattlers. So we had 3 tenants in the building. 2015, all of that unraveled. It looked like the Rhinos were dead in the water at that point. And then David and Wendy came in and as the White Knights, the week before, the city was going to make a deal with the New York Flash. So the Flash were going to be tenants of the building. And they came in and they were able, with the USL, they were able to convince them that the direction that the USL was going in addition to providing the city with new AstroTurf for the stadium, they convinced everybody that the Rhinos should continue to play in the building. Over the last 2 years, in 2016, 2017, the success on the field was continued to be what it was always. I mean, we were always contenders. We had won the championship in 2015, so there was never really any issues in regards to that side of the equation. But the fact that we weren't drawing well was part of the reason that our demise started to happen. The ownership group felt that the location of the stadium didn't necessarily benefit the team, and they felt that continuing to operate in that building wasn't doing us justice, and that's why we went on a hiatus. At the time, it was only supposed to be for, I think, 2 years. So now I think we're pushing into 2021. They feel that playing in the Champions League is probably not being, well, at least it wasn't being supported in the building we were in. Whether a new building can support it, we won't know until we get our feet wet again. So the intention is to start off in Division 1, and then if we have success in it, like we've had in the past, then certainly they'll look at bouncing back into the Champions League.
Listeners, if you have any comments or thoughts regarding the interview or overall with the Rochester Rhinos, send them in, tweet at us, email us at Uncle Sam's Soccer Pod or Uncle Sam's Soccer Podcast at gmail.com. Come back next week for part 2, and until next time.